Right, so it's been more by-election misery for Labour around the country as another 16 seats that have been vacated have been decided this week. And again, the obvious conclusion for that is that they have been punished at the polls by the populace, both for their domestic policies, no different to the Tories, more misery, more austerity to come, whilst at the same time still backing unequivocally the actions of Israel in the Middle East, causing global distress and national disgust. This time, however, we've gained some insight into exactly why, on the ground, Labour are losing out, as I've very helpfully been passed a breakdown of experiences that Green Party volunteers discovered locally and observed on the doorstep in one of these seats. And if this is the picture being replicated across other seats, as these results across the board appear to imply, Labour are in a shockingly bad place right now, and with even more misery to come. May's local elections look set to be historically devastating for Starmer's awful administration, and few people, frankly, will have any sympathy for them for that. Right, so by-elections again. Following on from the bumper crop of these we had a month ago, many of which had been vacated by councillors who have moved on to become MPs, so it is again the case here. More vacated council seats, a glut of them, caused by newly elected, mostly it has to be said, Labour MPs. Of the 16 seats that were up for grabs, 9 of them were due to councillors having vacated, been elected to Parliament. And not all of them were Labour, there was a few Lib Dems in there as well. But of these 16 seats, Labour were only standing in 14 of them anyway. And of these, one was a Scottish seat where ranked voting came into play, so different motivations influencing how people voted because it was a different system. But the remaining results were nothing to shout about at all. Catastrophic once again, as they were last month. But before I get on to that story of how things played out on the ground in one of those seats, as written and sent to me by one of my Green Party comrades in that area, and I appreciate you acknowledging my personal bias on such things as a Green Party councillor myself ahead of that, I do think it still reflects a lot of Labour Party opinion elsewhere as well. See what you think in a moment. But first, let's look at the results as far as Labour stood elsewhere as well. First, those 2 seats that Labour didn't stand in, just for completion. One of these was in Cumbria. This was a Lib Dem hold, gaining ground over the Tories, who were the only other party happening to be standing there. And the other was Llanberis in Wales, a Plaid Cymru hold over the Greens, Lib Dems and an independent. The Scottish seat was a Labour vacation as the councillor for Falkirk South, Ewan Steenbank, has become Scotland's youngest MP for Starmer's Labour. It's a weird one because they use ranked choice voting rather than first past the post. So people put the candidates in preferential order, and then by process of rounds of elimination, they arrive at someone with more than 50% of the vote. And as such, after 7 rounds of counting, I might add as well, Labour did eventually hold it. Even though, if you look at the first preferences, the SNP actually got the most votes. The local vote still very much reflective of the general election, it has to be said, as Labour notionally gained 8% while the SNP and Tory vote dropped. Now this ward certainly isn't reflective of Scottish general election polling mood right now though, as an MRP poll on Scottish voting intention that came out just yesterday implies that Labour would now lose 34 of their Scottish seats should the general election be held again right now, with the SNP gaining 39 seats, also at the expense of the Lib Dems and the Tories. So Labour is rumbled in Scotland there, despite this local election result actually implying otherwise. But the other 13 results were much more clear-cut and much more typical of the kind of results we certainly saw last month, and clearly getting no better this month. We'll start in staunch Tory country though, Windsor and Maidenhead in the ward of Sunningdale and Ascot, and you cannot imagine the Tories not holding their seat here, and indeed they did. Their vote share perversely going up 18%. Though it has to be said there was no Green candidate this time, which is likely where some 13% of that vote came from. But facing off against the Lib Dems, Labour and an independent, Labour came last, getting little more than 3% of the vote there, seeing their share collapse by 11.6%. Again, we're looking at the same sort of double-digit losses we saw last month. This scale of loss was also repeated in Stockport. There was a Lib Dem stronghold up for defence there in Bredbury, Green and Romley, where the Lib Dems gained another 7% to take 65% of the vote and very much hold it, standing against the Tories, Labour and the Greens again, with Labour again losing over 11% of their vote share, gaining just 5.5% of it. There was another Stockport ward up for grabs too, Cheadle West and Gatley also up for grabs, also a Lib Dem defence, both of these Lib Dems from Stockport having become MPs. And it was another stronghold for the Lib Dems here, although they lost 12% of their vote in this ward, they still held 45% of the vote. And Labour nominally gained 0.5%. What? Bring it on. bringing their vote share up to 20.1% here. So far losing most of their vote share or basically standing still. And that only got worse, even where they held seats. Labour lost their seat in Rodbourne, Cheney and Swindon to the Tories at that. Labour losing nearly 20% of their vote as the Tories mopped up most of that, weirdly enough. Keswick in Cumberland, Labour held despite losing over 17% of their vote share. And a second seat in Cumberland, Weatherall, which was a Tory defence they held on to, despite a small loss in vote share themselves, but Labour losing over half their own vote share, down more than 15%, holding little over 12% of the vote. Tirryminack in Ceredigion saw the Lib Dems hold that ward. They were elected unopposed last time, so Labour getting just 1.4% of the vote share there still counts as a gain technically, but it's not exactly anything to holler about. Again, it's basically standing still. And neither was holding on to their ward of Royston Palace in North Hertfordshire, now held by just 0.3%, as Labour saw their vote share fall by over 12%, with the Lib Dems now breathing down their necks. The Tories gained a seat in St Albans from the Lib Dems, but Labour came a distant last. Again, over half their vote share fell, leaving them with just under 4% of the vote there. And Labour held Belvedere ward in Bexley, despite losing over 14% of their vote again, just 6% now between them and the Tories there. The Tories took 2 seats off Labour elsewhere, though, as they lost a ward in Greenwich due to a vote share collapse of 9%, and in Holme Valley and Kirklees Council, a Labour stronghold, as that is widely seen as, last of the summer wine country, as despite the Tories losing 2% of their own vote, thanks to Labour losing almost 19% of theirs, they lost the seat and the Tories gained it. And so this brings us to the last seat of the night. But the one I know the most about, as this was in Ashford in Kent, where it has to be said the result was very narrow. But the story behind it, as sent to me by local Greens, well, it's a tale that needs to be told, and I'm more than happy to tell it. Labour lost the ward in question here, Aylesford and East Stour, to the Green Party, with Labour losing just 1.2% of the vote, it has to be said, but the Greens gaining just under 3%, meaning they took it with a margin of just 0.6% now, giving the Greens 9 seats on Ashford Borough Council. The seat was vacated by a Labour councillor, Sojan Joseph, who beat the Greens in 2023. So the Greens got this seat back, essentially. It's a marginal. But the campaign story has been passed on to me by the deputy leader of the council, Steve Campkin. And it seems that Labour threw the kitchen sink at this seat to hold it from head office and still lost it. Here's Councillor Campkin's account. Hi Damo, I thought you'd like to know that Ashford Green Party won their 9th seat on Ashford Borough Council. We won 8 seats in 2023, with Tom Pizzi losing to Labour's Sojan Joseph, with Al Arnold, Green, and Sojan Joseph representing Aylesford and East Stour, a 2-seat ward. The Greens teamed up with the Ashford Independents to take the administration from the Conservatives in 2023, with Labour abstaining on the leadership vote, and Noel Ovenden, Ashford Independents, was elected leader of the council, with Steve Campkin, Green, as deputy. Sojan was elected as Ashford's first Labour MP in the general election, with the Greens' Mandy Rossi doubling her vote share to come fourth. With Sojan stepping down, a by-election was triggered, with Labour campaigning before it was even announced. After 5 weeks of campaigning, Labour head office sent a team of 40 activists down to knock on doors from 7 in the morning. The Greens had 4. Labour were knocking on every single door 4 or 5 times, while the Greens were only targeting their own supporters. Mid-afternoon, the Greens stopped knocking as people were getting very angry, and we figured Labour were doing the job for us. At full council this evening, only 2 Labour councillors turned up, one of them armed with 12 questions to Cabinet, mostly aimed at the Greens on the Cabinet, while Labour councillors were still out campaigning, seemingly under instructions from Labour head office. At the count, the Greens won with 299 votes to Labour's 293, after Labour called for a recount, which found a Green vote had accidentally got counted as reform. It's worth mentioning here that the count staff had been working for 24 hours straight at this point, and mistakes get made. Green Party candidate Tom Pizzi was elected as the new Green Party councillor for Aylesford and East Stour, alongside his longtime friend Councillor Al Arnold, meaning every borough seat in the county ward of Ashford East, also held by Steve Campkin, is now Green. And the Green and Independent administration on Ashford Borough Council is now a little stronger. Well, isn't that interesting? Many thanks to Steve Campkin for sending that to me. Is Labour head office now getting so panicky about local election results that this is the scale of what they're prepared to do to defend their seats and they still fail? Perhaps it puts all those other losses they've experienced in a little bit of perspective, where they lost it by even larger margins, where perhaps they didn't try to campaign as hard. Perhaps head office wasn't driving the campaigners. But even when they do get driven, as appears to be the case in Ashford, they still lose. Since the general election in July, there have been 92 council by-elections for 94 seats. Labour have lost 17 of them, have held 34, but even where they've held, they've more often than not lost vote share in the double digits, and they've been in government for just a little over than 100 days. We still have what is widely expected to be a devastating budget for ordinary working class people coming at the end of this month. We have what will be a long and very cold winter for many to come after and before the next set of local elections, where people have gone back to old habits perhaps, and this is why we've seen the Tories gaining again now in defiance of this Starmer-led Labour administration. But the Greens are proving there is a third way. There is a progressive change we can all make, an alternative to vote for, to break the wheel, break free of the status quo that just keeps the country running for establishment interests and never in ours. And they are still making gains too. More people need to hear of it, to have a little bit of hope that there is another way. The mainstream media will never tell you about it. You'll never get accounts such as that from Councillor Campkin here anywhere else. And I thank him again for passing that on to me to be shared, because stories like that make a difference, make people believe change is possible. And the more people that can hear stories like this, the better. And the more hope for real meaningful change and not false promises or pledges there will be. If you missed my coverage of some equally appalling by-election results for Labour from last month, demonstrating a distinctive trend now as this is, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks.